Hello, U.S. history people. Today I want to go over the timeline of pre-American history and early American history to show how and why the United States came into being. And in order to do that, we really have to go back to the fall of the Roman Empire around 500 AD. And then for the next 1,000 years, from 500 to about 1500, is a period that we know as the Middle Ages. It's also called the Dark Ages and the medieval time period. The loss of centralized government in the Europe and the Mediterranean basin meant that the governance fell to local warlords, which developed what we call the feudal system, where there were kings, nobles, knights, and peasants. And peasants were just part of the land. Didn't have any particular rights or freedoms. They were just owned by their superiors. If we take a look during this 1,000-year period, it's called dark. It's the time when the bubonic plague or black plague came about. Waves of it came through. It's during this time, in this power vacuum, that this red line shows up of the rise of the Islamic Empire. And this rose up before the year 700 and all the way up to the middle 1400s. It had penetrated Europe, the Middle East, North Africa, and kept pushing to try to get into Europe. And it finally goes dotted somewhere in the 1400s when the Spanish kicked the Muslim Empire out of Spain. But it continues, the red line continues to be dotted till today, because the focus of the Islamic Empire and belief system is to an attempt to conquer the world. So that hasn't stopped. They just haven't managed to conquer all of Europe and a big chunks of the world yet. Also during the Middle Ages, you'll see this green line from before 1800 up to the year 1000. And the green line represents the Age of Viking Exploration of the Northern Hemisphere. They sailed by means of the North Star, didn't have a compass, but they were very good sailors and were raiders, and they raided and conquered all around the Northern Hemisphere, throughout Europe, went up every river in Europe, all the way to Italy, to the Middle East, and brought back to Norway, where they principally were located, brought back the things that they had taken from others. Pillaged England and Ireland and Scotland a lot. As a result, a lot of the people there were descendant from Vikings as well. They settled down in around the year 1000 and in Normandy, which is an area of France just across from the English Channel. And a Viking descendant named William of Normandy, when the English king died, who was a relative of his, a cousin, William of Normandy thought he should be the king. And so he took and built 1,000 ships and crossed with his army across the English Channel and proceeded to conquer England. They call it the Norman Invasion. And he set up then a centralized government where, once again, instead of being decentralized, it was centralized. He conquered every castle in England, replaced the nobles that he had killed and displaced with his own army captains, set up a whole new noble class, and they were all relying on him at the top for his largesse. So now you have a new centralized focus or government, and he lasted for about 20 years before he died, and then sons and grandsons and great-grandsons became kings. A great-grandson was named first Prince John and then later King John. They called him Evil King John, and he was the evil Prince John in the fame of Robin Hood stories, whose older brother was Richard the Lionhearted. Evil Prince John was actually the fourth son who ultimately became king. But he was so hated by his people, by the noblemen who had had the castles around England, because he was a liar. He would raise their taxes and accuse and kill his political enemies. He had 17 children, 5 of them by his wife, the other dozen by other people's wives and daughters, which did not endear him to the people. So at some point then, in 1215, the nobles, 25 of them, got together, each with their own army, and met the king in a field outside of London and said, "You need to sign this paper with the king's signature and the king's seal. Because if you don't, we're going to put your blood on it, meaning they're going to kill him. And of course, the paper we know today is the Magna Carta. That's Latin. In English, it would be the Great Charter. What this did is it had 63 principles that had limits to the king. Gone was this idea of divine right of kings, that whatever the king said was law. The noble says, no, wait a minute. The king has to follow the law. That's one of those 63 principles. The king has to ask permission from the nobles to raise taxes. The nobles have to agree. And if the king is going to accuse somebody of a crime, they deserve a jury trial from their peers. All of these principles exist today in the modern United States. The government has to follow the law. The people have to agree through their representatives to any tax increase, and people are entitled to a fair trial and a jury trial. So there are other things that were in the Magna Carta that were stated with regard to the restraints on the king and what liberties that the people had. So this was in place for many years, from 1215 on. The king didn't like it, evil King John. He fought, went home, gathered a bigger army, and tried to fight it for a year before he died of dysentery. But then his sons and grandsons and the kings thereafter were obligated to honor the Magna Carta. We then go up to this period in the 1400s where the Spanish threw the Muslim Empire out of Spain. The problem was that the Spanish Empire, the Muslim Empire, was so powerful in the Middle East that it plugged up all the traffic that Europe would otherwise have had going to China, the Silk Road to China, going to India, the Spice Islands. So it inhibited the trade. And Europe wanted to continue that trade because those places had things that Europe didn't have. During the Crusades, around 1200 AD, they were aware of a lot of these products that came from the East, but they were unable to get them. So they developed the sailing around Africa, and so you find this true in the 14 and 1500s, and they were sailing to get around Africa, and a fellow by the name of Christopher Columbus convinced the Spanish to let him sail to Asia by going across the Atlantic Ocean. And of course, Columbus knew the world was round. He was an accomplished sailor, had sailed all over from the Middle East all the way to England and Iceland up in the North Atlantic. His wife was from the Azores, a Portuguese woman, lived out in the Atlantic Ocean. And so, but he found the world was larger than what he had anticipated, and then came to the what we call the West Indies or the Caribbean in 1492. And then began the age of Columbian exchange, where the Spanish continued to come across the Atlantic and bringing many colonists and conquistadors across, and took gold and silver that they found from the natives in Central and South America. They also conquered the Aztecs in Mexico, turned those areas into Spanish colonies, and ultimately became their own countries. During this time, then, of course, the Spanish were very powerful, and they were very wealthy with the amount of gold and silver that they were pulling out of the Americas. So England was really playing second fiddle. They really couldn't compete until they defeated the Spanish Armada, and that turned things around for them in the late 1500s. And in the early 1600s then became the first permanent English colony in America in Jamestown, 1609. 1619, 1620 came the second permanent English colony in America, and that would be Plymouth Colony in Massachusetts. And after the success of the colonies, for the next 20 years, thousands and thousands, dozens, there was 20, 30, 40,000 people came from England to populate the colonies, the period of great migration, and America was now growing. Why did they leave England? Why did they leave, or Europe? They were coming from all parts of Europe to come to these colonies. Well, let's take a look at the list of reasons why they would come across the Atlantic and risk their lives. One of them was they could practice the religion as they wished. There was a religious conflict between Spain and England. One was Protestant, the other one was Roman Catholic. Spain was Roman Catholic. So and even in England, even though it was Protestant, you had to practice it the way the Church of England said, or you were subject to being burned or otherwise executed or tortured. So you had many Christians who were not Catholic and did not behold to the flavor of the Church of England, wanted to practice the religion as they saw fit. Printing was coming into fore, the publication of the Bible so people could read. The other thing they wanted was security. They weren't secure in Europe. There were civil wars going on all the time. And as we say, Britain and France were in a war every Monday. There was always conflict going on. Get away from that conflict. In America also, there was opportunity to own your land. This was unthinkable in much of Europe. The land was owned by the noble class. And an opportunity in America to practice the occupation of your choice. Not something that you were born into, but rather something that you liked and wanted to do. And then the most remarkable thing that well, they were all remarkable, but a quite remarkable thing was the opportunity for self-governance. This early American colony, House of Burgesses, up from the Virginia colony flowing forth from 1609, is they could elect their own local representatives to make the local laws. And something similar happened up in Plymouth, Massachusetts, where they established their own local government. So these were absolutely critical to them, that this was a big pull to come to America. It was also a push because they didn't to get out of Europe, because they didn't have all of these things in Europe. Now if we take a look then, 474 years after the Magna Carta, another bad king rose in England, King James II. He was doing naughty things. They didn't like it. Parliament said, go away or you will die. And they said, what are we going to do for a king? We'll bring his eldest daughter and her husband to England. They were at the Netherlands at the time, and make them the new king and queen, William and Mary. And they did. King James II, the departing king, left with his life. And the new queen and the new king came. But in order to do that, Parliament in England said, you've got to sign a piece of paper. And this piece of paper is called the English Bill of Rights. And it mirrored many of the things that were in the Magna Carta. It was a restatement that expanded the rights of the people. Unfortunately, the colonists found out in America it didn't apply to them. So they didn't have the same expanded rights that the people in England did. Then we come to the middle to late 1700s, the French and Indian War in America, which was also called the 7 Years' War in Europe. Was Britain and France getting into a war again. Indians were on both sides. Colonists were fought with the British, and they learned how to organize, how to fight, how to supply a militia or an army. Britain was victorious, but they put the bill on the Visa card, ran up a big bill, and so they increased the taxes to the colonists. Colonists didn't like the big increase in taxes. Great Britain left 10,000 troops in America. Somebody had to feed them. And so this was a problem, that they were occupying the port cities. The troops, British troops, were collecting taxes on all imports and putting the squeeze on the colonists to get as much as they could out so they could pay the bankers, pay the Visa card for that World War that took place in America, the French and Indian War portion of it. And on the heels of that came 1776, the Declaration of Independence. This Declaration of Independence was suggested by Benjamin Franklin, written by young Thomas Jefferson. Ben Franklin said, he can write better than I can. Why don't you have him do it? And so young Thomas Jefferson, age 31 with red hair, penned the first version of the Declaration of Independence, which was passed and thus launched the United States of America in 1776.